Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Friday, December 20th, 2024, and today we're going to talk about crops from cover crops, and it's Feedback Friday. So let's do it. All right, welcome to Friday, everyone. This will be the last day you hear from me until after Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Those are important. With family stuff, just no easy way for me to do shows next week. So anyway, I hope everyone has a nice break, nice meals, nice family time. If you're missing me and need something to do, you can always watch Brighton and Hove Albion play a couple matches over the next week and know that I'm doing the same thing at the same time, probably using some choice language. So feel free to join me. Anyway, because it is Friday, and that means it's Feedback Friday, where we look back at the week's podcasts and some of what you all were saying. On Monday, we discussed days to maturity and the real cost of starting a farm, and got a lot of great comments about people's own startup costs. I also liked this from SCW6GT, who wrote, quote, about DTM, don't forget the July 15 rule for summer/fall planting. For every week you plant after July 15, add around 4 days to maturity. That around 4 days turns into around 6 in September, which it depends equally on your weather. Also, don't forget that plants respond not only to temperatures, but also very much to whether the day length is increasing or decreasing, which is why planting during a 10-hour day in November yields different results than planting during a 10-hour day in January. Likewise for bolting, it's not only temperature dependent, which is why lettuce, cilantro, Chinese cabbages, spinach, and so on can hold for long periods of time during decreasing daylight hours of fall and winter compared to spring. And Jesse, you are right. SCW6GT is not my real name. You know me as Susan on the Patreon. End quote. Yeah, I don't have anything to add there except that I love my Susans. And we'll get into the other way to measure how long it takes to grow something, growing degree days, GDD, when we return after the break. Another comment was in reference to the real cost of starting a farm, and it comes from longtime contributor A.E. Norris, 2431, who wrote, quote, I have started this year for about 6,000 euros. That covers irrigation, a carport with walls, and enough compost for about half of my eventual beds. Also some 70 fruit bushes. However, I can sell off the front gate, no market fees, and can use a pre-fenced property for free, no rent, even if rent would only be a couple $100 anyway. Add the value of tools I already had, and it's maybe 8,000 euros spent. Oh, and the half year with very little income, loads and loads of work because time is money and farming has a lot of time to ramp up. And they added, I will probably come in around 10,000 euros total for building out the remainder of my 3,000 meter squared lot. Some trellises based off vineyard stakes, which may be vineyard stakes, I'm not sure. Some IBCs to buffer water, lots more compost, municipal and cheap for mulch, and some odds and ends, end quote. Just so it's clear, the euro is about $1.04 right now, so it's almost a 1-for-1, if that's helpful to understand that comment. And yeah, I mean, some people will be able to pull all of this together for $10,000 or potentially less in the first year, while others will have land costs and not own any tools. Also, you may have to factor in things like insurance and extra costs that maybe weren't apparent in the beginning, but will become apparent over time. And it sounds like you don't need a tractor or anything, so that reduces the cost a lot. Same with delivery vehicles and that sort of stuff. There's plenty of room to crunch the startup capital numbers down. And in some cases, not starting with every single tool you may ultimately need can really help save money and dial in processes so you can really focus your purchases on tools that you absolutely need and when you think and exactly when you need them. I think, if anything, going through that list I gave in that podcast episode or at the forum is a good place to start to get a realistic look of what it would cost you specifically. This commenter, maybe some of the expensive stuff like rent or irrigation or whatever it is, you can get for free. So you may be able to reduce those costs. Also, selling off the farm will probably not be enough to make a full-time living. So as they expand, that might require new expenses. So maybe in year 3 or 4, new expenses come on that weren't there in year 1. Anyway, you can decide for yourself, like this commenter did, what you do and don't need to worry about. Anyway, on Tuesday, we had on the amazing Mimi Castile to discuss the wine industry. Loads of great feedback on that episode as well. I know that I personally loved chatting with Mimi. I always do. But I'm glad you all took a lot from that as well. Several people brought up alternative products, like this comment from @Kabak, who wrote, quote, "Get the health positives about wine vinegars out there, not just for the alcohol. Local is life. I think you're right. Everybody should be exposed to a variety of farms growing up. Thanks for making the podcast and vids," end quote. Yeah, thanks for the comment. Vinegars, sure. And also other people have brought up alcohol removed or alcohol-free products. I've mentioned juices and ciders and mocktails before. There are certainly products that can come from these vineyards that are not wine, that are not alcoholic, but also for some of these growers, it's about that fermentation process and about the craft and about the artistry of making wine and not just about having a product to sell. Also, at the same time, I still believe there is a lot of potential left on vineyards, even if it's not all dedicated to making wine. But even with a slowdown in wine sales, I still believe there is plenty of room for artisan wines as well. Even if fewer people are drinking, maybe choosing cannabis over wine or just not imbibing at all, there will still be plenty of people who are drinking and who like fine wines and really interesting wines, just maybe less so than there used to be. And the storytelling and experience will become a bigger part of it all, as Mimi mentioned. Wednesday, we talked about drying greens and drying racks for lettuce at Harlow Custom Microgreens, who I think I met in North Carolina once. So shout out to them. They wrote, quote, "Huge bonus for the drying screen is a place to clean out chickweed, pine needles, or anything else that got into the greens before they hit the packing table." Yeah, that's a great point. I think when it comes to packaging and selling products, especially in a retail space, there's really almost no room for error. You cannot just give customers a slug or a stick or a spider or even a ladybug and be like, oh, well. And although chickweed is delicious and healthy, it's not generally what the customer ordered, like Harlow Custom Microgreens has noted here. And I know there are growers who can get away with not washing their greens, and a few of them chimed in, but not washing is not without risks either. Bird poop, bugs, all the things. There's no easy solution. And sure, some customers are going to wash their greens no matter if you sell them washed or not. But for me, I'd rather it be as close to the end product as possible. And I know most of my customers feel that same way. With fear of sounding righteous or something, if I didn't have ladybugs and spiders and such crawling around in my greens I grow, as annoying as they are to get out, as an ecological grower, I would be at least a little bit bummed. Then yesterday we discussed legume inoculants and how farms already team up and collaborate. This comment on collaboration from @Felix Chatsworth stood out. They wrote, quote, "It broke my heart reaching out to the very few farmers in my area when I was breaking ground and wanting to share costs /rent/buy a percentage of a BCS. In the end, I had to just buy one myself. But because I'm irrepressible, like Monkey, which I think is a reference to an 80s show, the next gen that want to borrow it will do so with my open arms," end quote. Thanks, Felix. And I like that attitude. Intertwining finances is messy and complicated. And even when it's not, it is still a bit unnerving. So a lot of people will run into this. For many people, there are loads of questions that have to be answered and assurances that have to be made for sharing an expensive piece of equipment like that. For some, they probably just feel embarrassed asking the basic questions of what happens if it gets broken? Whose farm does it live on? What if I need it, but someone else is using it? What happens if it gets stolen? Those sorts of things need some answers. Maybe there's a lawyer out there who could put together some generic contracts and offer that as an affordable service to growers. That would be cool. So that someone like Felix here could go to other farmers with a contract in hand and be like, this is how it works. Literally all of your questions answered. Anyway, lots of room for unique ideas in the collaborative space. And I appreciate Felix taking that initiative there. Good on you. All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll take a question from a Patreon member, BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil is a worker-owned co-op in Cleveland, Ohio, making NOP-compliant living soils for organic growers. Everything from Tilth is compost-based, and they divert around 4,000 tons of food scraps from landfills each year. I have used Tilth Soil for several years now for my plant starts. I love the results. I get consistent germination and consistent growth, plus excellent customer support. It's a lovably nerdy cast of folks who run Tilth. So start your season with excellent germination and strong transplants. Check out Tilth's pre-sale pricing for the 2025 season at tilthsoil.com. That's tilthsoil.com and click Farmers. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider kicking in a few bucks over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will even answer your farming or gardening question here. So that's fun. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Josh, who writes, quote, "New time supporter, yet long-time listener. Thanks, Jesse, for the content that you put out." Thanks, Josh. "My question relates to the cut flower potential for Lacey Phacelia. You've touted that as an ingredient in your favorite fall cover crop cocktail with cilantro and crimson clover, but is there a secondary benefit from that flower in a cover crop for cut flowers in an early spring? Asking for someone wanting to do cut flowers for the farm stand, and getting early bouquets is a showstopper if it's possible." End quote. Okay, so great question, Josh. Indeed, I love Lacey Phacelia. I think I first heard about this cover crop from Steve Groff on a podcast somewhere. And anyway, I've been hooked ever since I started growing it. Now, keep in mind that I am not a cut flower farmer, so I cannot advise on stem life or stem length or any of those critically important things you all have to worry about. There may be varieties of Lacey Phacelia that are better than others, and there is certainly room to breed better varieties for whatever it is you're looking for. What I can say is that is a very nice Mayflower here in Kentucky, Zone 6B. Easy to grow, easy to harvest, loaded with bugs, and very pretty. It lasts for at least a week in the bouquets, at least the bouquets that we make for the house. I also like that it can be planted with cereal rye, which itself makes a great addition to bouquets in the spring. Ditto oats and winter wheat. Cilantro is another one that will flower in the spring, and like you mentioned, can go in the cover crop mix and come out a flowering product right around the same time as the Phacelia. In order to have success with either, you need to sow them later in the season so they don't get too big and then die in the freezes. I don't believe crimson clover makes a great cut flower. I guess I don't know that, though, somebody can chime in and let me know. But if it were me, I would just go with rye, Lacey Phacelia, and cilantro in a mix, and then use those cuts. Maybe you could throw in a few peas or maybe even crimson clover just for the nitrogen fixation for the cover crop. Then get what you need, and then everything else is just cover crop, and then you can just terminate that however you planned. Now, in terms of profitability or efficiency in harvest, I can't advise you there. I have no idea if it would be worth your time, but it certainly would be an earlier spring flower that's easy to grow and is just hanging out feeding your soil. Also, you can sow it as late as February and still get flowers, though I have no idea how that affects stem length. The competition from the other crops usually makes these things grow pretty tall, but I'm not sure about the strength of the stems or any of that stuff. Now, if you're in a much colder climate than us here in Zone 6B, you may have trouble overwintering this one. I actually used to think, and maybe even said before, that Lacey Phacelia needs some sort of vernalization or stratification, essentially meaning exposing the plant or seed to a certain amount of cold to flower, but I cannot find anything to back that up. So I may have been wrong there. According to Johnny's, you can plant this thing all season and get flowers, and they recommend making 2 to 3 successive sowings, 2 weeks apart for continuous blooms through the season. It's always amazing to me how random ideas like that Phacelia needs a vernalization, get lodged in your brain without you realizing it. I do love that flower, as do the bees and bumblebees in the spring. They go absolutely bananas for it. It's beautiful. It smells nice. It really does all the things for soil. All the Phacelia on this farm. In the summer, I will sometimes throw some zinnias and cosmo seeds in our long-term summer cover crops, along with sunflowers, but of course not the expensive pro-cut sunflowers that cut flower people usually grow, but I don't know, sometimes I can use them. But again, not a flower grower, more like a dude who likes to pick flower bouquets for his wife every few days and likes butterflies. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that cleared some of that up. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we're just going to continue talking about, the idea of getting crops out of cover crops. So yeah, be right back. Okay, so generally speaking, harvesting from cover crops defeats the purpose of cover crops. However, there are some exceptions, like the flowers we just talked about, but also some potential vegetable options. Now, what I mean by defeats the purpose is that the purpose of a cover crop is to leave the nutrients where they are, not remove them from the field in the form of vegetation or fruit or whatever. With cover crops, you want to grow them for a while, Have them do everything in preparation for going to seed, but kill them before that point so your intended crop can take advantage of the nutrients and such that they have gathered inside and around their leaves and roots, of the microbes they've encouraged as well, of how much they have benefited the soil in general. It's a bit cruel, but basically we want to steal all their hard work. So indeed, letting cover crops get all the way to fruiting or seeds is to lose some of that benefit. But there are some exceptions, or at least some ways to harvest out of a cover crop that don't have significant losses or repercussions. My mentor, Eric Smith, used to do something that I thought worked pretty well. Basically, we would sow a fall cover crop around mid to late September, if memory serves, of mustard greens, kale, hakurei turnips, collard greens, and daikon radishes. He called it the forage crop. And we would just go out there and harvest the greens and turnips and radishes and take a lot of stuff out of the field, basically thinning the cover crop as we went so that other parts of the cover crop, like the canopy, like the greens, would continue to grow into that space. Now, yes, we were stomping on stuff and it wasn't super efficient, but it was one of those things that it wasn't a crop you were relying on, so it just became a bonus area from which you could get extra crops for, in that case, the CSA, while also having a diversity of brassicas to help feed the soil over the winter. Then in the spring, that patch would flower for a bit and we'd turn it under, keeping in mind that a lot of those crops would overwinter in the growing zone that we were in, which was 7B, I think. When I have extra radishes and turnips and kale seed at the end of the season, I will often throw those into overwinter cover crops. So if I want or need, I can snag a bonus crop out of there without having to think too much about it, or I can just eat some turnips while I'm out in the field. In the summer, you could do this with things like the old chard or beet seeds that you have. Of course, I certainly prefer having all of those crops in a nice, neat row if I'm going to harvest them, but I am always surprised at how well they grow when they're just spread out in a diverse mix like that. Now, I'm good with leafy, regrowing crops like kale and other big leafy greens and even root or stem crops, but I don't want any fruiting crops in my cover crops, really. This primarily is for the above reasons for not wanting a crop to senesce and use all the nutrients it gathered in making its progeny, but also because I don't want to inadvertently propagate diseases. Moreover, the risk of going to seed is a bit too high. Like if you had a bunch of paste tomatoes out there and you don't harvest them all, you miss some of them, that's a big ups in terms of weed seed. And by weed seed, I mean tomato plants. If I threw some squash out there in the summer, which I will sometimes do in places where I'm not growing squash, the risk of it getting some sort of disease on the leaves and spreading, that is not generally worth it if you're anywhere near where you plan on growing squash. Generally, you want your cover crop to be a species that are not the same as the crops you grow. That's because cover crops can be a good opportunity to add some diversity to the soil, but it's also because you don't want to accidentally cause issues for those cash crops coming in. Now, there is also the case of grazing cover crops to, add protein, I suppose, to animals. But that's maybe for a whole other subject, because grazing cover crops is complicated because of the amount of nitrogen and richness of cover crops. So you can make animals sick by letting them just go bananas on cover crops. But anyway, maybe I'll save that for another day. Let me know if there are any ways that you have used your cover crops for profit or just you for the kitchen. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up there and sign off until Monday, December 30th. I hope everyone has a great break. I have holidays within holidays, so it will be quite busy and quite fun for me. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and to the team at No-Till Growers for their support. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer over at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where when you sign up at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of December, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to, where'd they go? Somewhere here. Dave Casey, Bruce Wiley, Jason Bryce, and Mason Kelsey. This is actually a dance troupe of farming TikTokers called the Old MC Donalds. And this was a made-for-TV movie where they follow the behind-the-scenes struggles from cauliflower to choreography. It will change your life, or so say the reviews, but it probably will. Otherwise, thanks for watching and or listening. Have a great break. I will see you on Monday the 30th. Bye.